Hello and welcome to the Scottish Parliament Party Leaders Virtual Question Time. As so many others are doing around the country, the Scottish Parliament is adapting to the practices involved in working remotely at this difficult time. Tomorrow at 2:30 p.m, we hope to expand this virtual question time format to include up to 20 MSPs putting questions to 4 Cabinet Secretaries. Today, however, we have the party leaders putting questions to the First Minister. And I'm pleased to say we've been joined from St Andrews House by the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, and from their homes and constituencies around the country by the leader of the Scottish Conservatives, Jackson Carlaw, the leader of Scottish Labour, Richard Leonard, the co-leader of the Scottish Greens, Alison Johnson, and the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Willie Rennie. Now, before we turn to our first questions, I'd like to ask the First Minister if she can update us on the Scottish Government's response to COVID-19. First Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I do wish to give a brief update on some of the key statistics in relation to the COVID-19 in Scotland. As at 9 o'clock this morning, I can report that there have been 7,102 positive cases confirmed, which is an increase of 354 from the figures reported yesterday. A total of 1,799 patients are currently in hospital with either confirmed or suspected COVID-19, which is an increase of 51 from yesterday. A total of 196 people as of last night were in intensive care with confirmed or suspected COVID-19, and that is an increase of 1 on yesterday. And in the last 24 hours, I'm afraid that 80 deaths have been registered of patients who had been confirmed through a test as having the virus, which takes the total number of deaths in Scotland under that measurement to 779. And yet again, I want to extend my condolences to everyone who has lost a loved one. And again, extend my thanks to all health and care workers and indeed to everyone who is keeping essential services going across the country. Notwithstanding that difficult and upsetting news, we do firmly believe that the lockdown is having a positive effect. So, for example, while we still see fluctuations, we are not seeing at this stage significant or sustained increases in the number of people in hospital or in intensive care with the virus. However, we know these lockdown measures take time to work, so we must continue to exercise caution in our predictions. We are by no means through this yet. Later today, I'll be joining COBRA, where each of the 4 UK governments will take a decision on extending the current lockdown beyond the 3-week period we set out initially. And I will give a further update after that meeting. But I want to be clear now that the decision of the Scottish Government is informed by advice from the Chief Medical Officer and our own scientific advisory group, chaired by Professor Andrew Morris. I'm as keen as anyone is to lift these restrictions, but I will not begin to do so until I am convinced that we have done as much as is necessary to suppress the virus and that we have a clear plan in place to continue to contain it once these measures do start to be lifted. Over the next week or so, we will work to develop that plan and to share the approach with you and with the public. But for now, my message continues to be to stay at home except for the essential permitted purposes and to follow all of the public health rules. This continues to be the way that we slow down the spread of the virus, protect the National Health Service from being overwhelmed, and crucially, it is the best way to continue to save lives. So my thank you to everybody for the compliance so far.
Thank you very much, First Minister. We'll turn now to questions. First question from Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. That high number of deaths, even as we see a stabilisation in the number of new infections, just reminds us all how very real and tragic the impact of coronavirus is. And again, I extend condolences on behalf of everyone in my party for all those who lost lives and relatives over the course of the last week. First Minister, it's clear this morning that care homes think they are being treated, and I quote, as second-class citizens. The Scottish Government made some good announcements yesterday, but care homes have been an obvious risk since the start of this crisis weeks ago. One care home manager said, "We are getting warm words from government, but what we need is concrete action." First Minister, surely they are right.
First Minister.
They are right, which is why concrete action is being taken and will continue to be taken. I want to be very clear, firstly, there are no second-class citizens in the fight against this virus. Every life matters, that is regardless of age, background, or where somebody lives, at their own home, in a care home, or whether they're in hospital. And that is why the advice is so clearly focused on saving lives. There has been clear guidance in place since the start of this crisis to care home providers about infection prevention and control. Public health directors in each of our health board areas, local health protection teams, the care inspectorate are working to ensure that that guidance is being implemented and followed. Both I and the Cabinet Secretary for Health are closely monitoring that situation. We'll continue to support care homes through provision of PPE, the equipment that staff need to protect themselves. We, as you say, made some announcement yesterday around how we can continue to use testing effectively and strategically, while taking care not to allow testing to give false assurance, because the most important things are around infection prevention and control. So this remains and will remain throughout this crisis an area of intense focus for all of us.
Jackson Carlo.
Thank you. I think I understand that testing will now be given to every resident displaying symptoms in care homes. And, you know, frankly, it may have been a mistake to have limited this just to 3 tests per home. And we know there are still issues with the scale of testing. A few weeks ago, the First Minister announced to Parliament that by this point, mid to late April, we would be building up to 3,500 tests a day by the end of the month. Can the First Minister tell us how many tests she expects to happen in care homes? And can she confirm if every new resident entering a care home, a potential unseen carrier of the virus, will now be tested before they are placed in a care home which may have had no experience of the virus before?
First Minister.
Can I take those questions in turn? I'll be as brief as possible, but I want to address them all properly. Firstly, in terms of our testing capacity, we are on track to reach the 3,500 tests per day by the end of this month, and we intend to go beyond that as we go into May. It will continue to be important to build up that capacity, not least because of the role testing will play in any exit strategy from the lockdown measures right now. In terms of what we said yesterday about testing all symptomatic residents in care homes, let me stress again, that does not change the clinical management of either residents or outbreaks of infections in homes. As my advisors tell me, whether 1 resident, 5 residents or all residents have been tested, once it is established the virus is in a care home, it is infection prevention and control measures that are important. What we announced yesterday was about, and I think rightly, building the confidence and assurance of relatives who are worried and want more certainty about the conditions of their relatives in care homes, and building that public assurance. And I think at this stage, as we build up capacity, that's the right thing to do. In terms of new residents going into care homes, this is where I think it's important that testing is used appropriately, but that we don't run the risk of it giving false assurance. Let me remind you that testing is only reliable when somebody is showing symptoms. So if somebody is tested before they're showing symptoms and tests negative, it doesn't tell us for sure that they're not in the incubation period and won't develop the symptoms of the virus in the days ahead. So we need to do proper risk assessments. Those in charge of people's care and admission to care homes need to risk assess that properly. But anybody going into a care home should have the guidance that has been given to care home providers fully followed. Unfortunately, as with the rest of the population, what we are asking residents in care homes to do in terms of isolation, not gathering together communally, eating on their own, that's really tough, but it is really important. So these measures are the most important things that care home providers have to do. And as I say, health protection teams and the care inspectorate will be working hard to make sure that those rules and that guidance is followed and fully implemented.
Jackson Carlo.
I think that final point on new admissions is helpful, because I know that many constituents have been concerned about new admissions into care homes where they may have relatives, and wondering, you know, whether or not that was bringing the virus into the home, and that's obviously caused them some distress. The First Minister said last week that people who need to shield at home could register for a text service to pass their details on to supermarkets. Now, this week I've been contacted, I'm sure their MSPs have too, by a range of people who've had problems with the new service. Just one example was an 82-year-old lady with respiratory problems. She registered for the text message. She's had no response. She hasn't shopped now for 4 weeks. She's relying on a local charity. So can I ask the First Minister, how many people have now had their details passed on, and how many of those people have now received deliveries?
First Minister.
Okay, I'll give specific figures for that in a moment, but can I say two things by way of introduction? Firstly, there were some problems last week with some mobile phone providers that were quickly resolved. So some people who were registering and not getting a reply, that was the reason, and that was and has been fixed. If any of you are hearing or getting contact from constituents or still having problems, please pass these on immediately so that we can investigate and resolve and fix these. In terms of the figures, so we now have 60,000 people who have registered through that SMS service. 43,000 food packages have been ordered, and that's the free food packages that are being delivered through the national contracts, and they are many of them have been delivered already, others are in the process of being delivered. I have had contacts from people saying they've got them and that they're very grateful for them. 21,000 people have requested that we pass their details on to supermarkets so that supermarkets can prioritise them for deliveries from there, and their details have been shared with supermarkets. So that is all happened, is happening, is underway. With any system like this that is put in place quickly for good reason and is complex and large scale, there will be glitches and there will be individuals who have difficulties, which is why we want to hear about them so that we can fix them quickly. But the system is working, and the numbers I've given today, I think, evidence that.
Jackson Carlo.
So it's about 40% then have registered, and about 15% who've received parcel. Yeah.
Registration
we've raised care homes before, and we've raised the vulnerable people before. And I mean, I respect the fact the First Minister assures us progress is being made, but more people tell us that it's not working for them. So take just one example. We've been approached by a constituent who has terminal lung cancer. He has COPD, he has HIV, but he hasn't yet received a letter confirming he is a vulnerable person. And until he does, he feels he can't leave his home, he can't get a food package, and he can't register for a priority treatment. So that's what some people are still telling us, First Minister. Are you certain now, or are you able to say when you'll be certain by, that every vulnerable person is now getting the help that they need?
First Minister.
We are certain that everybody who's been identified by the clinical process, I don't decide who is in the vulnerable shielded group. I'm not a clinician. That is decided by those who are qualified to do that. We originally said that would be up to 200,000. We then thought that would be 120,000 through further checks and making sure everybody is captured. That figure is 157,000. All of those people have been notified. What I would say to anybody who thinks they should be in that category but hasn't had a letter, contact your GP to discuss whether you're not properly in that category or whether you should be, and it will be rectified immediately. In a situation like this, as I say, we will get individual cases where further investigation is needed, and there is an absolute guarantee to address that as quickly as possible. I don't think it is true, though, to suggest that there are growing numbers of people for whom these systems are not working. We are making these systems work, they are working, and we will continue to resolve the individual cases, however many of them there might continue to be, to make sure that these are fixed as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much, First Minister. Question number 2 from Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I return to the question of the conditions in Scotland's care homes? Yesterday's figures showed that as many as 1 in 4 of the recorded deaths are of people who are resident in our care home sector. And people who I speak to are afraid, but they are also angry. And they cannot understand why up until now so few tests have been carried out in the care home sector, and why so many people working in the care home sector still do not get the adequate personal protective equipment that they need. So, First Minister, how can you justify this situation?
I wouldn't justify that situation if I thought that was a fair representation. We are continuing to work to make sure, firstly, that PPE supplies are are sufficient and that we get them quickly and efficiently to the front line where they are needed. So we monitor supplies literally on a daily, several times a day basis. We have and continue to streamline the distribution routes. We have been in discussions this week with having set up the triage system and the local hubs. We are in discussions now about trying to get more of the supply direct to care homes themselves. So this is an ongoing process that has absolute importance attached to it. In terms of testing, as we have built the capacity of testing, so too are we testing more people, care workers and residents as well. So in terms of health and care workers, already more than 12,000 health and care workers, or where appropriate their families, have been tested already, and we are seeing absence rates in the health service related to COVID have been falling, which will partly, I hope, be due to that. Around 20%, just under 20% of that total number have been staff in the social care sector, and we want to get that percentage up, obviously, and as we increase testing capacity, that will happen. So these are areas of ongoing progress where we are putting new systems in place. We're doing so quickly, and as we go, we are resolving issues and glitches and problems along the way, and that is a daily process that through a crisis situation like this will continue.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you. I mean, trade unions have described our care homes as a crisis in a crisis, and today's newspapers report soaring levels of staff absenteeism in our care home sector. And the Scottish Government has repeatedly been asked how many workers have been tested, and we've been repeatedly promised that those figures would be published on a regular basis. So my question is, does the Scottish Government know this figure of the number of care home workers who have been tested? If so, can you tell us what that figure is today? And if not, why not?
First Minister.
I did tell you in my previous answer with respect, I said over 12,000 health and care workers, or where appropriate their families, have been tested, and just under 20% of that were workers, and where appropriate their families. Remember, where it's a family member who's symptomatic, it's the family member who needs to be tested, not the worker. So just under 20% of that 12,300 are in the social care sector. So I did give that answer in my first response. More generally, in terms of the care home situation and your characterisation of a crisis within a crisis, there is, what we've got to recognise here is that this is a virus that we know older people are more susceptible to becoming seriously unwell with or dying from. We also know that any institution, including care homes, there will be a greater susceptibility to spread of an infection like this. So that makes it all the more important that we do treat care homes with particular care and attention, and that is what we're doing. We have, when we look at coronavirus, we've got community transmission, we have challenges around hospital infection, nosocomial infection, which we're looking at particularly, and then we have the risk of infection within care homes. All of these issues are being treated seriously, but infection prevention and control, appropriate use of testing, and of course making sure that staff have the appropriate protection, these are all absolutely essential priorities as we deal with this.
Richard Leonard.
Thanks for that answer. I mean, the expression crisis in a crisis is not my expression. That's the expression of the trade unions who organise in that sector. And part of my question was about the regularity of publishing that information. I just think it's so important that the government is accountable and publishes on a regular basis the number of people who have been tested, both NHS workers, but also those people working in the social care sector, because again, people are saying to me that they feel that the Scottish Government is being too slow, and the expression which is often used and put to me is a warning that there is a real fear that there is too little too late. And so I would ask you, First Minister, do you disagree with that view?
First Minister.
Yes, I do disagree with that, but what I would say, we are in an unprecedented crisis. The entire world is dealing with an unprecedented crisis. It is by its very nature a rapidly evolving situation. All governments are being challenged literally every day to make sure the speed of our response is commensurate with the scale of the challenge. And we are working incredibly hard to do that, putting systems and responses in place, adapting and changing them and responding to any flaws in them as we go. And that's not easy, but it is our responsibility, and we will continue to do that to the absolute best of our ability. I also absolutely agree with the accountability point that the Scottish Government right now is publishing more up-to-date information than I think any other government across the UK. The figures for the total number of COVID-related deaths that we published yesterday, for example, is more up-to-date than anything elsewhere in the UK, and we are continuing to look at how we break down the information that we publish as far as we can. So the figures I've given you today, we do intend to publish them more regularly, but we need to make sure that some of the data that we're gathering now is not data that we've been gathering previously. We're gathering it now for this purpose. So we've got to make sure the systems of gathering it are producing data that is reliable and robust. And as soon as we are confident that it is, we will go into, as we have done on many things, regular publication. And that will apply to these figures. We publish daily figures right now of the number of tests carried out, and the breakdowns of that we will publish as we are confident in the robustness of that information.
Thank you. Questions now from Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I too would like to express my sincere sympathies to all who have lost a loved one, and my grateful thanks to all who are working in our NHS and in social care, in our public services, in our shops and beyond. First Minister, it's absolutely vital that lockdown carries on as long as it needs to be, and that it's not lifted a minute sooner than is safe. We know that people are feeling cooped up. We know that some people are feeling terribly isolated, and we can't thank them enough for the efforts they're making and for the lives that they are saving. But it is important too, and I think you alluded to this in your opening, that people know that there are plans being made for a clear exit strategy to end lockdown safely when the time is right. So I've spoken with experts, and the scientific advice seems clear. A test, trace, isolate strategy is needed to prevent further outbreaks in the future. And I'd just like to understand if the Scottish Government are committed to such a strategy, and when the Government might be in a position to share more of that information with the Scottish public.
Well, thank you for that. And let me, as briefly as I can, just set out my thinking on that right now. Firstly, unfortunately, lockdown is going to continue beyond this week. My advice, COBRA will meet later on, and other governments have to reach their own decisions. My clear advice is that we must continue the lockdown measures for at least another 3 weeks, because while we are increasingly confident that these measures are working, we are not yet confident enough that the virus has been suppressed sufficiently to lift any of these measures, because the risk of doing that would be a resurgence that would be extremely damaging. But people do want to know what the thinking is for beyond that period. Now, we don't yet have all the answers to that, because no government does. But I think sharing the thought processes and the factors we are taking into account and the framework for making these decisions is important. I hope over the course of next week to not announce all of these decisions, because we won't be able to do that, but to set out that framework of decision making. We have to monitor the spread of the virus very carefully. We have to assess the options for lifting the restrictions and what the impact of that would be on the virus, on the economy, on well-being more generally. And given that we're going to be living with this virus for some time to come, we have to consider what takes the place of any measures that we lift in order that we continue to suppress it. And that's where test, trace and isolate comes to the fore. And I am absolutely of the view that that has to be a key part of any longer term strategy to get life back to normal as much as it's going to be possible to do that while this virus remains a challenge. But I hope next week we'll be able to set out more of the principles and the framework for that decision making.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that, First Minister, and I can absolutely assure you that the Scottish Greens are wholly committed to ensuring that lockdown lasts as long as it is required to do. But there are two things in that, the test, trace, isolate strategy that we'll be looking at in the future to carry it out to ensure that we can safely exit lockdown. We need the capacity to test every suspected case, and we need the capacity to trace everyone who has come into contact with a confirmed case so that they can isolate and prevent the virus from spreading. So can you elaborate? You've said that you hope to be carrying out 3,500 tests by the end of this month. Will that be sufficient? Will that be up and running when we need it? And how many trained contact tracers do we have at the moment? Is that something that's been put in place too?
Well, can I explain firstly, certainly in the Scottish Health Framework, contact tracer is not a kind of standalone professional designation. So you will have many people within health protection teams and other parts of the health service who will, when required, perform those tasks. But for that kind of approach, and that may not be the only part of an exit strategy, but it will be a key part. Yes, that will mean expanding testing capacity beyond the 3,500 by the end of this month, and that's why we do have plans to take that further, and we'll be able to set out more about that in due course. It will mean expanding that network of how we trace contacts, and technology will also potentially have a part to play there as well, although there are significant issues around privacy that we have to work our way through in some of that. So all of this is work that is underway. It is developing all the time, and both the detail of that, but also the general principles which will govern this are ones that I want to be open to as much public discussion as possible. We're all having to live with this virus. We're all having to live with the restrictions on our lives, and some of these restrictions are likely to be in place for a considerable period of time. That means we all have the right as well as a duty to understand this and to contribute to that discussion about how we best take ourselves forward in a way that balances suppression of the virus with as much normality in our everyday lives as possible.
Thank you. And questions from Willie Rennie.
I just want to follow up on the care home questions about testing from earlier. I'm still concerned that new residents with the virus have been admitted to care homes and they're full of vulnerable people. I think we should be testing all potential new care home residents, and they should not enter if they test positive for the virus. I mean, one care home owner told me just this morning that all potential new residents is the most important test that we can do. So, First Minister, why is it that we can't just test all the potential new care home residents?
First Minister.
Let me try and again, because I can understand the starting position that says that's what we should do. So you used a phrase at the outset there, new residents with the virus. Now, if somebody has been in hospital because they've had the virus, they will be tested before leaving the hospital to make sure they test negative. That's where somebody has the virus. People who don't have the virus, if they are not showing symptoms, if you've got somebody being admitted to a care home today, they are showing no symptoms of COVID and they test negative, that doesn't mean they will not be showing symptoms of the virus tomorrow, because they could be in the incubation period. So testing does have a part to play there, but it must be part of a properly risk-assessed approach, and it must be part of an approach that prioritises the importance of infection prevention and control. So whatever the test status of somebody going into a care home, the guidance around isolation and the wider guidance around infection prevention must be followed. That's the most important thing to do. And so, yes, we must use testing where appropriate, but we mustn't allow testing, given its limitations, to give us false assurance that somebody going into a care home doesn't have the virus, when it may just be that they're in the incubation period and it doesn't show in a test.
Willie Rennie.
No, I do understand that, but I think people find it difficult to understand that even people who don't show the symptoms are not being tested before they enter a care home. These care homes are full of vulnerable people, and I think they should be tested in advance. And I would hope the First Minister will just look at that issue again. We do need the lockdown to save lives, but tension in the workplace is rising again as companies say they can operate within the public health guidance. But the Scottish Government is saying that non-essential businesses should stay closed. Walker's Shortbread Factory plans to reopen soon. A factory in my constituency is planning to reopen in 2 weeks. And the construction industry have told me that after the Easter break, many companies will start work again. What is the advice for non-essential businesses who can demonstrate that they can operate social distancing and good hygiene in line with public health guidance? Can they reopen, or must they stay closed?
First Minister.
Before I come on to the question about business, can I just briefly conclude on the question about testing? Because I think you asked me, will we consider testing everybody who doesn't have symptoms? The problem with that, And I want to see testing used to the maximum where it helps us with this. So that's not the issue. The problem with testing people who don't have symptoms is that the test result is not necessarily reliable, because it will tell you they don't have the virus, even if they might be in the incubation period. So it doesn't necessarily tell you reliably what it is you want to know. And the danger is it gives a false assurance that somebody doesn't have the virus when maybe they do, but it's just at a stage where it's not showing up. So we must keep prioritising the infection prevention and control. On businesses, the advice to businesses stays as it has been from Scotland. This is an area where we have taken a tougher line than some other parts of the UK, which some have criticised us for, but I think it is appropriate. So there are some businesses that are being told to close. Shops, pubs, restaurants, for example. There are others that we know have to stay open because they're essential to keeping the lights on and food supplies being delivered. But in the middle, we've tried to give very clear precautionary guidance. If what you're doing is not essential, if you can't allow your workers to work at home, if you can't be absolutely sure that you've got safe social distancing, then on that precautionary principle, prioritising the health of workers, you should be closed. And right now, that guidance remains as it has been. We will continue to seek to speak to individual companies where they need more advice and to address any concerns that companies or workers have. But right now, it's about making sure that we are prioritising the fight against the virus and keeping people safe.
Thank you, First Minister. Thank you, colleagues. That concludes today's virtual question time. We hope to continue tomorrow with a virtual question time from party members to Cabinet Secretaries at 2:30 p.m. But thank you for joining us, and I close this meeting.